be talking to you. As Tanya said, I was in Kiev 2 years ago, I think, and at the Cambridge Day, and I loved it. It's such a wonderful country, and the teachers were fantastic, very engaged, very enthusiastic, and it was a great pleasure, and that's why I'm really looking forward to talking to you today as well. So thank you very much for finding time to join us. And let me just move on the slide. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this subject of improving your learners as learners is that it is part of the new curriculum in Ukraine, which is being introduced. And one element of that is протягом усього життя. Życia, I think. So apologies for my mispronunciation of Ukrainian, but I understand that is the phrase which means lifelong learning in English. And in that new curriculum, they talk about 7 goals under lifelong learning. So know what their students should know what their communicative goals are. They should have and develop effective learning strategies. They should be able to work on their own to develop learner autonomy. They should be able to manage their time effectively. And then there are 3 goals which are really around attitude, frame of mind. So they should be motivated, they should be persistent as learners, and they should develop confidence. And I think those are all good things, but none of them are easy. So as teachers, this is a difficult task, a great challenge. And Anna has just said my Ukrainian is great, so thank you very much, Anna. Okay, so what I want to do is to talk about how we can help you, or how we can think about implementing, achieving these goals for your students. And the first question I would ask is, do we really need to do this? Because it's in the curriculum, but we know that there won't be any direct test of this in the exams. These are not things that you can test in exams easily. So why do we need to do this? Is it important for teachers to give time to this? And I think there are 4 reasons why it is important. The first one is when I say sharpen the saw. I don't know if you use the same metaphor in Ukrainian, and perhaps you have a different metaphor, but when we talk about a carpenter or a woodworker is going to do some work, you need to sharpen the saw so that his work or her work is achieved more easily. So it's the same with our students. Most of their time at school is spent learning. So the better their learning skills, the more they can achieve at school. The second reason where I put personalize is that each student has got different needs, different interests, and the more that they can develop their skills in learning, the more control they can have of their learning, the more they can do those things which are most relevant and useful to them. And then the third point is learning a language takes a lot of time, and it takes more time than we have available in the schedule in the classroom. So students who are going to be successful in learning English have to be studying beyond and outside the classroom. And that's where we need to help them to use that time most effectively. And then the fourth point is that what motivates us often is what we're good at. And so it's a kind of a circle there, that the better we are at something, the more motivated we are to continue doing it. So what we want to do is to make our students better learners so that they are more motivated to continue learning. So those are reasons why I think it's really important that we try to develop the learning skills among our students. Now in Cambridge we've been spending quite a lot of time thinking, well, what does this actually mean? What are the learning behaviours that we as teachers need to develop in our students? And we've put them into 3 categories, 3 groups. The first one is planning and goal setting. The second one is the way that they manage their learning. And then the third is the way that they reflect on what they're doing and how successful they've been. So those 3 main areas. And that's what today, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through those and think about how you can help your students with each of those areas. Okay, so the first area was planning and goal setting. And within this, there are kind of three things I think that are important. First of all, they need to have a sense of what they're trying to achieve. Why are they really learning English? This will depend on the age of your students. If they're getting close to exams, they'll be thinking about that. If they're older teenagers, they might be thinking about what they do afterwards. But for a lot of people, students, they're younger than that, and it's just trying to imagine themselves being able to use English. It's part of their identity. And I'm going to talk about the L2 self in a second. The second area is about having a plan. What's your plan as a student to learn English, to study English? And then the third one is when you're actually doing a task or activity, being clear what they are trying to achieve, what they're trying to learn in that task. So it's kind of long-term, mid-term, short-term. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. I'm keeping an eye on the chat just to see if anyone says they can't hear me or any problems like that. Okay, so as I said, part of the planning and goal setting is to have a sense of what you want to achieve. If you can't hear the sound at the moment, that I'm afraid that's probably an issue that you've got with your access, because I think most people can hear. So L2 self is your sense of what you're trying to achieve. And I think one of the important things here is to remember we're not trying, of course, to turn your students into little English people. They obviously are going to be Ukrainian people who can engage with the rest of the world using English. So English is a tool for them, but they need to imagine how they would be using English. What are they really trying to achieve? And here are three ways of thinking about this question that you can ask your students. One is if they can think of somebody who they know who is good at speaking English. I put a picture here of Shinchenko, who is a Ukrainian football player who plays for Manchester City, and you often see him being interviewed on television speaking in English. And so, for some people he might be a role model of using English. Or that you might have somebody who they know who is a musician or a film star. Another way is to imagine your future L2 self. L2 is, sorry, I didn't explain, L2 is second language. So they're learning a second language, English, or it might be a third or fourth language. So imagine asking the students to imagine themselves when they are, say, 22, 23, and that they are good at English. What would they be doing? What are the kinds of things they would be able to do in English? What would they like to be able to do? And then the third tactic or technique you might use is to say to your students they can have 5 wishes. A fairy godmother is going to give them 5 wishes in their learning English. So what would their 5 wishes be? What would they like to be able to do? So all of these 3 things are just helping them to think about what do they really want to learn in the long term in their English. What do they want to achieve? The second thing I mentioned around this goal setting and planning is around kind of schedule plans for learning. And I think it's really good if you can help your students to try and think of the scheduling and intermediary goals. And by intermediary goals, I mean a goal for a week or for a month. And for the scheduling, it would be good if you can encourage them to think of a weekly or monthly planner. How much time is realistic for them to give to learning English? What would they learn? When would they do it? What time? Having that kind of schedule helps it to become real for them. And also to set these intermediary goals for a week or a month. Here I've given some examples. 20 new words in a week. Maybe it's 5 words, maybe it's 10. But they should set their goals. Or to listen to a podcast or to watch a film, something like that. So these are kind of setting these intermediary goals. And then the third point is when they're learning, they need to be thinking about what are they trying to learn in that subject, to make them more conscious of the point that they're learning in an activity. So there are lots of ways of doing this. This is one technique that I've seen teachers use, and this is using a KUL chart. They just write on a piece of paper, the students know, want to know, learned. And you can do this with different types of things. So you can do this, for example, with vocabulary. Maybe you're going to have a lesson where you're looking at vocabulary for types of food, for example. And at the beginning, you ask them to fill in the first column. What do they already know? So write down some words in English that they know for names of types of food. Then in the second column, things which they don't know in English, but they would like to know in English. So obviously they would be writing that in Ukrainian. What do they want to know? And then at the end of the lesson, or at the end of that activity, you can ask them to write down, well, what did they actually learn? What new words did they learn in the lesson? Okay, so that's getting them to think about what they're learning, what they're trying to achieve. Ah, yes, this is another little technique that I saw a teacher do, which I think is really good. So often in your course books, in your textbooks, they might be a set of can-do statements, or if there isn't, you might have that in your lesson plan, and what the students should be able to do at the end. And one thing you can do is ask the students at the beginning, well, how important, how much do you want each of these can-do statements? So I can write conditional if sentences with very few mistakes. That's a kind of grammar objective. Or I could understand most of the recordings in this lesson. That's a focus on listening skills. So they just put between 1 to 5, 1 meaning not much, and 5 meaning yes, really a lot. And that's at the beginning of the lesson. And then at the end of the lesson, you can ask them to score it again, each of those, in terms of how well they learnt those things. Do they think they can now give advice confidently and clearly? And all of this is just a way of helping them to think about what they're trying to learn in the lesson. Okay, so that was the first section. I was talking about setting goals, planning the learning. Okay, now we're looking at managing the learning. So when you're in your learning, how can those students make the most, be most effective in their learning? And here there are kind of 6 areas which you might think about that you can help your students with. So the first one is obtaining and using learning resources. The second one is developing effective learning habits. The third one is using learning techniques or strategies for learning. The fourth area is to manage their motivation. How can they keep themselves motivated? The fifth one there is making use of sources, so other people, making use of other people who can help them. And then the last one there is how they can create an effective environment for learning. So those 6 areas under this heading of managing your learning, we're going to look at those in a little bit of detail now. So when we talk about resources for learning, in some classes I've seen the teacher creates like a wiki or a place where students can add their ideas about resources for learners, or you may as a teacher prefer to control that yourself and have a list of resources which your students can make use of. Here I've created a kind of very short list here of some really good resources for learners outside the classroom. So some of those are podcasts. BBC is probably a bit more serious for older students. Pickle is for younger students. It's a wonderful resource for podcasts for younger learners in English. Lots of great discussions there. Online dictionaries, vocab apps, tools for helping their writing improve. I don't know if you've ever used it, but it's really good for students. Again, probably secondary students rather than primary. Listening skills, TED talks, and there's Ed TED Talks, which is particularly good for learners. Speak and Improve, again another app where students can practice their speaking and improve it. And then maybe they need exam preparation. So there's lots of materials. So you can create your own lists, or as I said, if it's appropriate in your school, you can ask your students to kind of bring together, maybe on a Padlet or something like that, their ideas. Obviously you have to check what links, if they're putting links on, you have to check exactly what links they're putting on. Okay, moving on. Okay. Second thing is talking about effective learning habits. We want them to develop that, and again we can help them with advice, and we can help them to in certain ways. Here are 3 techniques that are used for developing learning habits, which I think are quite helpful for you to share with your students. One is what is called implementation intentions. This is where students write down what their intention is, what their plan is, and just that act of writing it down and perhaps sharing it helps them to develop the habit. So in this case, as an example, I will revise vocabulary for 10 minutes in my room before breakfast. So saying how long, what, where, and linking it to something else, that makes it a really good intention, implementation intention. The other thing is habit stacking, and this is where you link one habit to an existing habit. So if you have take a shower every morning or every evening, to link your learning habit to that other habit which you already have. Similarly, so going on a bus journey, if you this is going to work, or going to school, I will listen to 10 minutes. So you're linking together a new habit to an existing habit. And then the third kind of technique around habits is not to make them too big. The 2-minute rule. So the habit should be to do at least 2 minutes. So read 1 page of a book, learn 5 words, 2 minutes of news, write 2 sentences. That's if you're struggling to implement your habits. Make them just shorter, because just starting is the most important thing. And then another area here is using learning techniques or strategies, and there are lots of strategies. These are 3 strategies which research has shown to be very effective. So when we look at the educational psychology research, they recommend these particular techniques, but people will have their own personal techniques as well. So retrieval practice, this is basically where you test yourself and what you've learned. This has been shown to be the most effective way of learning and studying, and to many of us it probably seems obvious, but I think it's useful to be reminded of this. So test yourself. Can I remember these 30 words? Can I redo this exercise and get everything right this time? The other technique or strategy is spaced practice. It's much more effective to do bits of learning over time with a space in between them than to concentrate all your learning into one big session. So rather than spending 2 hours studying, you should spend 10 minutes every few days. That's much more effective. And then the third one is deliberate practice, and this is sometimes we can do studying which isn't really pushing us. We're just going through a very shallow way of practicing. So deliberate practice is where you push yourself to improve on each attempt. And one technique there is students who record their speaking, they listen and then they re-record it so that they can do it better. And just that process of listening and setting out to improve it on the second go, that's deliberate practice, which really can help your students. I realize when I'm reading this it says your practice, yourself, so that's addressed to the students. So all this kind of advice I'm giving you is addressed to students, which you can use with your students. The next area is motivational management. How can you help your students to manage their motivational levels? Because that's the most difficult thing about language learning, is it takes a long time to make progress and people lose that motivation. So there are various techniques here. One is to keep a track of your habit. Streak. I expect you're probably familiar with the term streak. Streak is when you keep consistently a habit. So 5 days of doing the same thing, or 30 days. Don't break the chain. Set up targets and then rewards for those streaks. So I will have a takeaway on Friday if I complete my 10 minutes practice for 7 days, or something like that. Second technique is to make sure that you've got variety for motivation, because that's the more variety you put into your learning techniques, the more it helps motivation. And then the third technique I would recommend is having a sense of progress. Especially with language learning, it's quite difficult to know if your language is improving. But one of the things that I think is quite effective is to ask your students to keep a recording of them speaking or of them writing at the beginning of a course, of a term, a semester, and then to do it again at the end of the semester. And when they compare it, they'll be amazed at the difference, because they can see their progress in those recordings. Okay, we're moving on now, and so this is making use of sources of help, and this is, as I said, it's kind of using the people around you to help you as a learner. And people have different ways of doing this. One idea is to have an online English study group. It could be the students in their school, it could be friends that they have locally, or there are even ways of joining study groups which are international online. Another technique is to meet once a week for lunch with people who agree to chat in English for that lunch time. And the third technique, I think, is one of students keep a notebook of questions you'd like to ask to the teacher or someone else who speaks English. And I know as teachers, sometimes you don't have time to answer all your students' questions, but it's good if these are questions which they've thought about very carefully in advance. So I think that can be useful for some students. And then the last point in this area was to create an effective environment for learning. This is obviously depends very much on a student's individual circumstances, but making them think about it is really important. So it may be difficult for them to implement some of these. So establishing a quiet place to study English, well, that's what they want to try and do. Obviously not everyone can do that, but keep a vocabulary notebook next to their bed, to put language learning app top of their favorites, to organize their computer files, to find study notes, exercise quickly. These are things they can do to reduce the friction in starting to having a study session. How can they make it as easy as possible? Okay, I'm going to move on. I can see the time ticking away. Self-evaluation. So this is the third area. How can we get students to be better at evaluating themselves and evaluating their learning? Now, one of the things I would say to get started on this, because this is actually really difficult. It's really difficult to ask students to evaluate their own English, their own learning. So personally, I think it's quite good to start by just getting them to evaluate activities or lessons in terms of whether they enjoyed it, whether they found it difficult, did they participate in it, did they collaborate with other students. So those are things which they can evaluate without understanding a lot about language. And I think if you can get them to start to evaluate their lessons or activities on this way, then they start to get used to that process of evaluating, giving a score, making a judgment on an activity. So that's, I think, quite a useful first step. Another technique which I think is quite good to get started is something called exit tickets. You might use the same thing. I've seen teachers who have exit tickets, which means at the end of the lesson you say to them they can leave the class if they can just write on a piece of paper what they learned today. Or you can have something called traffic lights, where they fill in a piece of paper where they just say, today my learning, well, red light if they thought it wasn't a good lesson, yellow if they thought they were trying to learn something, and green if they think it was something that they did that went really well, their learning went really well. So sorry, they don't have to write anything, they just have to say red, yellow, green. And this is again just a way of them evaluating the lesson rather than their learning, or evaluating the activity. So that's getting them to think about evaluation. Then of course you want to get them to start thinking about evaluating their learning, and you can think about self-assessment, or you can think about peer assessment, where students evaluate themselves, because that's another way to kind of introduce the idea of assessing themselves by assessing each other. Someone asked, what's the difference between self-evaluation and self-assessment? Actually, they're the same thing. I should have used the same term. In this case, I mean the same thing. When you're trying to get them to self-assess or peer assess, I think there are 4 things that are important to remember. First of all, to focus on just one or possibly 2 things. So perhaps you've got them doing their speaking in a show and tell about their holidays, and you want them just to think about whether the student was clear, loud and clear enough, or whether there was not too much hesitating. So not everything, just 1 point or 2 points. The second thing with self-assessment is to balance encouragement and correction, because it's very demotivating to only think of the negative things, and we don't want to demotivate them. So always 1 positive comment, 1 correction or improvement. The third thing I would say is give them the phrases in English to use for giving feedback if they're doing peer assessment. It was good when you, or you should try to, or you shouldn't say. So that's they're learning English at the same time as learning the skill of self-assessment or peer assessment. And then finally, use criteria. This comes from a site called Twinkle, and I think it's quite nice here that the students are self-assessing their writing, and it gives them a number of criteria. But you can create your own criteria, or you can use criteria from other places. In fact, talking about criteria, you can also use descriptors. I think these come from Cambridge. These come from the Cambridge exams site, support site. You know, when you're writing a narrative, these are the descriptors. That's on the left. On the right is a set of codes which you can use. So if you're marking someone's essays, sometimes you use codes. I think you might say G for grammar mistake or something like that, but you can teach your students to use those codes when they are evaluating someone else's course work. So if they're swapping a piece of writing, encourage them to use the codes. Okay, moving on then. Self-correction. Yeah, encouraging self-correction. This is a technique I saw Herbert Puchter, a really good teacher and writer, using. So he would, if he was in a class, he would, if there was something which he wanted to work on, so in this case it's putting third person S on the verb. So he goes, she thinks, and the students would often forget that. So he put a piece of paper on the wall with an S on it, and every time a student made a mistake in that area, he just pointed to that, and then they remembered, yes, I forgot the S. And then after a while it just became very easy, just pointed to that, and they would remember, and they would start to correct themselves. But then he actually took the S off. He just put a piece of paper on the wall without anything, and he would just point at that, and they would remember straight away, yes, I forgot the S. And then he started using that for other things. So for example, the pronunciation of th. For some people that's a difficult sound, and so if they didn't pronounce that, he had another color paper with that on the wall, and he would point to that. So just using things which you can, without interrupting, just to make them think about, well, what did I make a mistake in that, and correct themselves. Okay, and so the last point really the last area that I want to come into is that when you're trying to encourage them as learners, I think one of the ways of approaching this is to make them think of their classroom as being a learning community, that it's not just the teacher and individual learners, but they together are a learning community, and that they can help each other learning, because as they help each other, they're developing independence from the teacher. So independence is not just about working on your own, it's about being independent from the teacher. So collaborative group work is really important. It helps develop that useful interaction, practice, feedback. It helps them teach each other, peer teaching. It develops a sense of responsibility, and often it reduces that anxiety that they have when it's a student and teacher interacting and speaking. So I really want to encourage you to build that sense of a learning community. And one of the things I find is doing group work is difficult. You know, anybody who thinks you can just put your students in a group and they will work together automatically, they are mistaken. Group work, as a teacher, you know group work is really difficult to make it happen. And so you have to have techniques and approaches to build up group working skills. It doesn't happen automatically. And one of the techniques which I think is quite useful is that you have a set of roles for that group. And the students, you assign those rules to students. Maybe after some time they can make decisions themselves about which role they take, but to begin with, as a teacher, you need to assign those roles. And part of that is that they understand what the roles are. So I've seen a teacher use something similar to this, where they have just a little exercise at the beginning where they ask them to think about what the roles are, and they have a matching task like this. So presenter tells the class what you do, note taker C writes notes about what you decide. All these slides I'm very happy to share. I'm sure Tanya will tell you how you can get hold of these slides afterwards. So if there are things you want to come back to, we'll have a chance. Now I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to move a bit more quickly. So when we're doing group discussions, as I said, we need to encourage them, develop them into that. I think it's good to have a particular process you go through when you set up a group discussion. You put them into groups, you check the instructions, you check the language points, you check the roles, you set the time limit. Each group presents results. You have some process like that, which makes sure you go through the steps, students know what's happening, and they become good at doing group discussions. I think it's good to teach them the language that they need to respond to other students in English, teach them the language in English. So if they're working together, you know, how do they build on others' ideas in a constructive way? How can they acknowledge others' points of view? How can they suggest alternatives? And how can they politely interrupt when they're short of time? So you can teach those phrases to your students. So for example, build on others' ideas. Yes, and another thing is, yes, that's true, and I also think. So in that way, you're teaching them English, but you're also teaching them the skill of responding constructively to what other students are doing. Because sometimes, you know, children can be a bit harsh with each other in groups. You need to encourage them to be constructive and positive. And so there are more phrases here for those other aspects of constructive response. And I would definitely teach those to your students. Obviously, the exact phrases depend on the age and the level of your students. This is just one suggestion. Another thing which I think is good is having a manifesto or ground rules for students for discussions. Sorry, this has got slightly mixed up, this slide, but what you can see, this is an example from one school called School 21 in London, and they asked the class, the teacher there asked students to write down their rules for discussions, and I think these are great rules. I love this example, but you can do the same with your class. Ask them to write their rules for what is a good discussion. And by the way, I recommend, if you have a chance, to go to this website, School 21. It's very inspiring, because this is a school which is quite poor children, but the teachers are so good at building their confidence that it's really a wonderful example of good teaching. Then about motivating students, as you know, as teachers, this is the big challenge. This is the most difficult thing to do. Students don't really want to be in school. They don't really want to learn a lot of these subjects, and it takes a lot of work and hard work over a long time. So you as a teacher, that's your great challenge often. And there are different ways of encouraging motivation, and I've given 3 examples here of things that help motivation. So one is the sense of accomplishment, being able to do something where there's a challenge, and the ways that you can give people that sense of achievement or accomplishment is to set target numbers or time limits, or have a bit of competition. These all give, and it's a bit like games that they'll do on their phones or computers. You're trying to create that sense of achievement in the short term, because learning a language is quite difficult to have a sense of achievement in the short term. This is a technique that we call this Naughts and Crosses, or sometimes tic-tac-toe. I'm not sure what you call it, but you can, if you're doing an exercise and you want to check the answers at the end of the exercise or its homework, instead of just asking each, choosing a student for their answer, you can divide the students into 2 groups, and one is noughts and one is crosses. And when you ask the question to the first group, and if they get it right, then they can put a cross in, and then you ask the second one, and they can, if they get it right, they can put a 0 on, but if they get it wrong, then they can't. So it kind of turns it into a game, just a little bit of activity checking answers. The second one I mentioned here is curiosity. So one of the things that motivates people is they are curious to know what's going to happen, and this can be cliffhangers. If you're doing a story, to stop the story before the end, so that and then ask them, or say you're going to do the rest of the story tomorrow, the next lesson. Things like that is just holding on to, or stimulating their curiosity. Another is just to use puzzles, and I mentioned anagrams here, and this I've taken from another teacher who was just doing a vocabulary task for nature vocabulary, but she turned each of those into an anagram, and it just added a little bit of a game curiosity element to the lesson. And then the last thing is fun, and as teachers, we struggle sometimes to do a lot of fun in a lesson. We can't do it all the time, obviously, but there are little things which can be helpful. And one of the things I think is really a nice example of this, using music, which is always fun for most young people, is a fantastic site called Lyrics Training. You probably know it already, but if you don't, or if your students don't know it, I recommend it. It does gap fills on songs, current songs, and you can do it fast or slow, or you can do it with lots of gaps or just a few. You can adjust it to level. So I think it's a wonderful site, and that's the kind of thing you can do to just add a bit of fun. Okay. I think I'm nearly the end. I just wanted to say, when you're talking about developing these skills with students, you have to remember it's a process, that it starts off with you telling them how they can do things, and then you're moving to a stage where you're helping them to do things, and then you're trying to get to a stage where they actually take control. But you don't get there immediately. You can't just throw them in the deep end and expect them to be okay. You have to go through a process, telling them, helping them, and then giving them the opportunity. And I just want to mention here that this learning to learn is part of our work we do for a range of life competencies. Tanya mentioned this at the beginning, that we look at a range of these and we try to help teachers with these different wider life competencies, life skills, or 21st century skills. And if you want more information on that, we have a website, cambridge.org/CLCF, where there's lots of information, lots of help and ideas for teachers, all for free, which you can get at any time. So go and have a look at that if you're interested in this area. And I think I'm just coming to the end, so I'm just summing up. To develop learning skills, develop planning skills, develop learning management strategies, develop self-evaluation, encourage a community of learning, and build skills and motivation. And I think you can remember that's my summary. If I just do this, can you remember the words there? Develop. If we're in a classroom, you would be shouting out to me, but you can't shout out now, and perhaps the chat is got a bit of a delay. Planning. Okay, Oksana got planning. Fantastic. And then develop learning management and strategy. Then develop self-evaluation. Build a community of learning. Build skills and motivation. Okay, much easier to do this in real life, in presence. Okay, so have you got any questions for me? I've tried to make sure there's a little bit of time at the end to ask questions. I'm not quite sure how you're going to ask questions. I think you're going to do it via the chat box if you are able to. So I'm here. I'm looking. Okay, how to prevent students taking advantage of ready-made answers from Wikipedia during the class. Yeah, that's an interesting one, and that is definitely one of the modern problems that teachers face. I mean, I don't know if there's a very easy answer to that, except to well, it depends a little bit on your setup whether you can stop them going online. But I think also asking interesting questions, asking students to work together, to combine things together, so that they can't just use a ready-made answer. But part of it is them understanding that might complete the task, but it doesn't help them learn for the future. I have to admit, I don't think I've got a very good answer to that one, but I know it's a big challenge. Okay, well, thanks. Oops, there was a question there.
Hi, I just in case popped up in case we have questions about certificates. Oh, there is one for you. How to motivate students when they are already overwhelmed with other things?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think especially in this last year with very difficult. Oops, sorry. Can you just mute yourself because I'm getting an echo. Yeah. Okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah, especially in the last year where there's been a pandemic, students working from home, studying from home, I think has increased the risk of students feeling overwhelmed. There's less support. They feel less supported. And of course, the curriculum always has too much in it. So I think this is a real challenge for students. I think that is one of the roles of a teacher, is trying to identify the things which matter most for their students. And I think part of that is around feedback, your approach to feedback. So I know some teachers feel uncomfortable with letting mistakes go past without comment. But I think as a teacher, you don't want to be picking out every mistake, every weakness that a student makes. That is not that's not going to make a difference to whether they make the mistake just by you pointing out every mistake they've made, every weakness. So I think being very careful about choosing the most important things to give feedback on. One of the things I mentioned in self assessment, but it's true for the teacher assessment as well, is to think of one or two things to focus on in a particular activity or a lesson, not to try and do too much. If it's a speaking activity, for example, are you focusing on clarity, just that, and not to be thinking about grammar and vocabulary and all the other things at the same time. Somebody asked for my email. It's on the screen now, so you can, if you want to contact me about anything, you can do that. How much time of Netflix would be enough for my students to watch cartoons daily? That's it should be no more than 10 minutes. Well, there's no answer to that, but I think there is quite I think one of the things we talked about habits was that they can set themselves a habit, which is to watch in English cartoons for 20 minutes a week or 10 minutes a day or something like that. If it's in English, then that can be good for them. How to encourage students to read, teenagers to read in English. Yeah, I mean, that's not just a language problem, is it? That's the same for English students in England. And part of and we're not helped by a world of social media where students are used to being distracted every 5 minutes. So being able, I certainly think one thing is to switch off a mobile phone while you're trying to read, because mobile phones are designed to distract you. I think doing things in small amounts is often a good approach, so that if you're trying to encourage them to read in English, really to start with a very small part to read maybe a couple of pages, and then to predict what's going to come next. It's also about finding the right material, isn't it? It's about trying to find books which really relate to the students and their experience, not to be thinking about what you think is good English literature from an adult's point of view. Nowadays it's so easy to find good teenage literature. Can you share your experience in discouraging copying from others? I think that's a bit similar to the Wikipedia one. I think I'm going to need to think about that, because I have to be honest with you, it's not something that I have given a lot of thought to. So you have to let me go away and think about that one. Is it possible to re-listen to online? Yes, you've already answered that. Tanya, are there other questions which I'm missing that you're seeing?
Yes, there is a nice question. I'd love to attend more detailed sessions on specific points from your studies: self-planning, self-evaluation, learning techniques. Are you planning to have something like that? From Tatiana Khaidayenko.
Yes. Hi, Tatiana. Thank you for that question. Yes, in a vague sense, yes, because I think this area of learner independence, learner autonomy, is one of the most important areas at the moment. I think it's one of the things that learning from home has taught us, has made us realize, is that some of our students are quite poor at learning techniques. This has really tested their ability to study themselves, and many of them are struggling. So I think we've learned that it's quite easier to control your students in a classroom, but when they're on their own, they're struggling. And so I am planning to do that, but I don't have a specific dates or plans, but yes, I will come back to these in more detail. Yeah.
Once you have it, I think all the information will be on our Cambridge resources. So follow our Facebook page and follow all of the news. There is another question for Ben to read, and I will just remind you that the certificates will be available after you fill out the form, the feedback form. And to have access to this feedback form, you need to either click on the panel on the top of your screen now, whether it's on the shield or on the logo. Also, you will receive a thank you letter with information from our cambridge.org website. There is a link that will lead you exactly to the Cambridge Life Competencies Framework resources, all the brochures and all the activity cards for developing life competencies for all the ages. And there will be the link to the feedback form that will lead you to the certificate. So you receive the certificate after you fill out the feedback form. Please be careful whether you completed all the steps before you start texting and telling there is an issue or something. So make sure that you filled out the contact form and then you got the certificate. Okay, that's it from me. Was there any other question?
Are we finishing?
No. Just there was a question about the certificate, so I told it for everybody. There was one more question. I think one more. Choose one to answer, and we will be finishing.
Okay. So I've seen a question from Anastasia about should the explanation come in Ukrainian or English for beginners. And my view on this is that we shouldn't be so strict that everything has to be in English, especially with beginners. You know, our job is to encourage and to help our students. We want to give them the experience of communicating in English, so that's important. But we're also trying to help them. So personally, I don't think there's a problem with Ukrainian teachers or any teachers using the language of the students at certain times, and sometimes that's an explanation or instructions in order to help them. Obviously, you're trying to move to using English more, but at the beginning, using Ukrainian is fine. There are some questions which, to be honest with you, I can't answer particularly well. If we were together, so for example, someone's asking about how do you get your students to use the English interface on their mobile phone. I don't really have a good answer to that. If we were together in a conference, I would be asking other teachers to suggest techniques and tactics they have for that. The question about dictionaries, do you use the book or the dictionary or the electronic dictionary? I would say it depends a little bit on the way that you're controlling your class. My instinct is to say use the electronic dictionary because that is what students will really use. You know, that's their natural way of doing things. But it may be that you have a policy in your classroom that you don't want your students to be picking up their phones in a lesson for various reasons, in which case you have to use the books. But yeah, my instinct would be to use the e-dictionary on the online dictionary, because that's really what they would use in practice.
All right.
Now,
many people can't see the contact form.
Okay,
The
I think
contact
we've come to an
form.
end.
we come to an end.
Yeah, the contact form will be there. There will be a link. Will be there in your thank you letter, or we can call it follow-up letter, that will appear on your email right after we finish the webinar. Also, it will be on a button when we finish the webinar, not right now. So just as I said, check your email box for sure. Check your junk email folder in your email box, and if you want to make it faster, when you finish the webinar, press the green button which will tell you follow the link or something like that. And I think this is it. Thank you, Ben, for such a great presentation. I love the pace you have all the time at your webinars, because I'm always so fast, and I'm now, okay, looks like I'm rushing that much. So I learned a lot from you, not to rush that much, and in that case it would be much more understandable. Thank you, and thank you for amazing ideas. This is something we often miss out because we want to follow the curriculum, and things you taught us today are really important. Thank you, and thank you for helping us to encourage Ukrainian teachers and to build the new educational system in Ukraine. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.